This is Nicholas Alexiou, Department of Sociology and Hellenic American Project at Queen's College. And we are very honored and pleased to have today with us a scholar, a renowned scholar, a poet, an activist, Professor Dan GEORGAKAS. And I would like to discuss, I want first to welcome you, Dan, and thank you for the interview. And the focus of our discussion today will be one of your books, My Detroit. And it is a mistake for people to think that this is a memoir, because it's not just a memoir, it is beyond the memoirs. You talk about change, a book about change, you say, from the early beginning of the book, and you talk about ethnicity, acceptance, continuity of ethnic groups, and the race question, one of the chapters titled Black Metropolis, where you talk about that. But let's start making an assessment of about the book, since we complete the 15-year anniversary from its first publication back in 2006. So,
well, it came out from Pella Publishing from New York, and got a good reception, and the pretty much sold out the first edition in a couple of years, which is, for a book like this, is good. And I like what you say, it's not really a memoir. The subtitle is Growing Up Greek and American in Motor City. And all those elements are very important, and I'll expound on them more as we go along. I was very happy a few years ago to have a Greek edition of My Detroit published. So I'm in Greece, and I'm just flattered that the Silarokosron, which is the choreo of my father, they love it. They love this book, and I've written to them, and they write back to me, and they want to have a festival in which they celebrate this book and show the short film about me. Now, I say that not from ego, well, although I'm very happy, but it really had a bigger effect than, let's say, Greeks of Detroit reading this book. And it was meant to have, I tried to have a bigger effect, and I wanted to go beyond the Greek community and explain put the Greek community in the context of 20th century America. Dispel mythologies, tell some ugly truths sometimes, and second edition is out. It's also available in ebook now. So I'm happy. I'm very happy. Let's start at the beginning.
yes.
And that is, rather than a family history, let's talk about a community history. The Greeks began to arrive in Detroit around 1900. And then it accelerated as the automobile industry accelerated. And practically every Greek I knew, foreign-born, was involved in the auto industry. Now, sometimes they were workers, like my Theo Jim, Kumbaro Stavros. They were workers. Others had candy stores and luncheonettes outside of the factory, and their entire business had to do with the factory. My father had a bar. He was a partner of a bar across the street from Hudson Motors, which was at that time a big manufacturing thing. So part of anybody who writes about Detroit has to talk about the automobile industry and the impact it had. And the automobile industry can be thought of as
And
a,
of course, Dan, what you're referring to the first mass wave of migration from Greece between 1900s,
yeah,
1920s, 1924.
Yeah.
And how do you explain or how you characterize the fact that the majority of the Greeks who came from the Peloponnese in particular, that your roots are from, the family comes from, they came from an agricultural society. And the moment they came to America, and to Detroit in particular, they got involved to the factory environment. They developed a working class class consciousness, perhaps, which is not the case coming as farmers, as people of rural rather than urban areas.
Yeah.
How that affected the whole.
The other thing is, of course, they were small businessmen. So they had the popcorn stand, the peanut
Yes.
pie at the luncheonettes and so forth. But the fact is that culturally, they were involved in industrialism. And the best thing that happened to them was the UAW and the Roosevelt's New Deal. But let's go back to 1900. So when the Greeks first arrived in Detroit, which has a strong racist tradition, by the way, Detroit had a group called the Black Legion, which was to the right of the Ku Klux Klan because they thought the Ku Klux Klan was too soft. And they had maybe 20,000 members in Detroit. They marched and they were powerful. So the Greeks show up and they're not sure if they're white or not. And so they're sort of considered quasi-white, especially most of the Greeks were from the Peloponnesus, but there were also Greeks from Smyrna in Cyprus, and they're Asians, you know. So Greeks could not move into every neighborhood. And what they decided, what came about was in Detroit, there was a downtown area, all the big shops and etc. And then there was a black area, which was very, very poor. And the Greeks settled, were allowed to settle in between. Like the Greeks were the buffer zone that keep the black neighborhood from coming into the commercial neighborhood. And that became Greektown. And Greektown would become a Detroit institution. It still exists in its last legs, but was very bright, vibrant up from 1900 through the 1960s, 1970s. And in the beginning, it was actually a settlement where people actually lived. And there was coffee shops, newspaper stand, barber shop, pastry shop, record shop, all this kind of stuff.
So you're saying that the pattern of settlement of the Greeks in Detroit brought them close to the African American community geographically,
yes,
and eventually culturally or socially or
okay,
politically, right?
That's what I want to go to next. As a great, first of all, because blacks were close, some of them end up working for Greeks. And if you're a smart Greek and you got a good worker, you treat them well because it pays off for you. So there was some relationship between, I wouldn't say they were friends, I wouldn't say there was anything profound, but they knew them. There was a familiarity. And going into the Great Depression, the Greek coffee houses, Greek diners, luncheonettes, really, they were more like luncheonettes, were willing to, the lower level were willing to serve blacks. And that was something nobody else in Detroit was doing. I mean, period. And then at some point, probably, I'm not sure if it's in the late 40s or early 50s, Greektown was next to the police station, big police station in the courthouse. And there were juries. And you had a jury and you had to give them lunch. The juries were integrated. And there was nobody would serve blacks. And yet they didn't want these people wandering all over. So the Greeks were given, the Greek restaurant owners were approached and they said, what if we bring over the juries? You want their business, but they're blacks. And the guy, yeah, there's a Greek guy, oh God, every day I'm going to get 15, 20 full paid meals and so forth. And the police are, the juries. So they said yes. And so Detroit, the Greektown, became a place where blacks could eat. Now that doesn't seem like much to us, but that had made a huge impression on blacks. The first black mayor in Detroit, 1970, said, the Greeks were the only ones who would feed us in the late 40s and early 50s. He remembered. And when they put together the electric train in Detroit, first stop was City Hall, second stop Greektown. Black mayor. And he worked with the Greeks because he felt comfortable with them. Again, I don't want to make it spectacular. I don't want to make it more than what it was, but it was there. It was there. I even remember in the 50s, somebody said, I'm going to invite my cooks to the wedding. And we said, well, that's good. So some of them are black. And people weren't down. If they liked that idea. And the guy said, well, they're not coming to the reception, but they're going to come to the wedding. So what I'm saying is, so often we get trapped in the images of the present to think of the past. For instance, Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, where you had the Italian pizza owner who was fought with the blacks, and he insisted on having only Italian names on things. Well, the Greeks weren't like that. Yeah, they put up their villages and so forth, but why not? These are my clientele. These are my people. If they want some, I'll put it up. They've sponsored sports teams and things of that nature. I remember one time, this is later, in the 70s, I walked in this big Greek diner in New Jersey, and the first thing I see is this huge picture of a rabbi. I mean, it was a full wall of a rabbi. I said, oh my, what's going on here? And then next over was a picture of Venizelos. And then I went in and I looked around and I realized a lot of the clients were Jewish. So the Greek guy put up, yeah, he's your rabbi. Yeah, sure. What do I, that's a different attitude than I'm only going to put up my people. And you'll see that later on in the turbulent 60s and 70s, there are cases where Greek diners would be surrounded by black neighborhood to keep it from being attacked, because this was one guy that was treating them decently. So there was that love and cordiality, but some kind of decency. And we've also learned recently that in the South, in the American South, the diners, many of them fed the protesters. Oh, it gets back to Detroit. By the following Oichi, Greek suddenly became okay. And we could move and live pretty much anywhere. Although even in the 60s, in the elite neighborhoods. They had a point system, and the more points you had to have so many points to get in. If you had too many points, you weren't allowed in. And the Greeks had 85 was their cutoff, and the Italians were 65, and the Jews were not allowed. So this is even in the 60s. But the Greeks lived in a neighborhood during the war where people lived close to one another, but it wasn't a Greek neighborhood. It wasn't every other house, but it was within walking distance, and everybody could walk to the church. I also point out that the Greek Orthodox Church that I grew up in, about a half a mile or mile up north, was Briggs Manufacturing. About a mile south was Hudson Motors and Jefferson Assembly. And then parallel to it was Mack Stamping and the tire company. So the parish was right in the middle of manufacturing. During World War II, Greeks accumulated money, like most people did. And at the end of the war, they decided to buy their own houses, very Greek. And they all moved about a mile or two east into a new neighborhood where they could buy their own house. And I call those neighborhoods the smorgasbord neighborhoods, because they are full of ethnic people. And my block, there must have been 15 different ethnic groups. And that included French Canadian, Serbian, Lebanese, hillbilly, Polish, Italian, Sicilian. I mean, in this one block. And they were also united in that in the morning, you got up in the morning, you saw people with their lunch pails going down to the bus stop to go to work. And the Greeks then were part of this neighborhood. And again, we didn't live side by side. One kubata was about 5 blocks this way. The other one was a 5-minute car ride the other way. The other one was a bicycle ride in another direction, but people could still be close. And then sometimes when people were a little closer. So that's in that smorgasbord neighborhood, there was ethnic consciousness.
It is interesting that you describe how multicultural was the area. Coincidentally, the new president of Queen's College, his name is President Frank Wu, he grew up in Detroit, and he told me in a discussion that he was, in a very close distance from the Greek community. He's an Asian American, Chinese American, and he knows your other classic book, I Do Mind Dying. So I understand how multicultural was the setting of the neighborhood.
And they didn't fight with one another because nobody was so dominant. And so, okay, wherever you are, you are. Now, I said it was a smorgasbord. We had Asians, we had Cubans, we had Jews, we had one Ethiopian who was not considered Black, he was considered Ethiopian. I tell people, you know where Ethiopia is? But anyhow, but Blacks were not in that neighborhood and were not allowed to move into that neighborhood. So in grade school and in junior high school, we called intermediate school, I didn't have any Black friends. In high school, my high school was integrated And that's when I began to meet blacks. But the attitude, you have to understand Detroit. Detroit is a very combustible racial situation. In 1943, there was a great race riot, which pretty much was whites attacking blacks, because blacks had come north to work in the factories, but they were restricted into a very narrow area. And the minute they try to move their houses or get a rental outside of that district, there was trouble. And so there was this major race riot. The National Guard had to be brought in and so forth. And one of the things I've discovered later on as I learned more, never in any textbook that we had did anybody talk about the race riot of 1943. It was like, didn't exist. Didn't exist. And that was right through almost to college. When you go to college, you could actually get a college degree in Detroit without ever having studied the race riot of 1943. Oh, so how did I become involved in it? Well, let me talk about the Greeks again. So I said the Greeks had this relationship with blacks, which, by the way, they also had diners, and the diners, they became community hangouts. And so if you're in a black neighborhood or a mixed neighborhood, you had mixed clientele. You know, it's pluses and minuses, but you were in physical contact. You knew people. There were guys you could say, I like that guy, I don't like that guy. Whereas some of the other ethnic groups, let's say, I don't mean to disparage anybody, but the Poles in Detroit had their own suburb called Hamtramck, which is all Polish, and they didn't allow anybody in. I mean, not anybody, but 80, 90%, and certainly not blacks. There was a lot of redlining and all this kind of stuff. So in that sense, the Greeks were quite different. Just the fact that they had some kind of contact. Now, I, being a historian, I loved history from the time I was a kid. I began reading about the Civil War and this and that. And then I realized if I got in my car and drove from my house to downtown, I could pass through the shades of Detroit. All white, scattering of blacks, more blacks, all black, then downtown. And you could see the different levels of living. Since it was the 1960s, by the way, I started out as a school teacher. We had a question of busing. And I think this is relevant for today. The black population was exploding. So the black district had to get bigger. What are you going to do? Either you have to get rid of you have to change the boundaries in some ways, which means putting blacks in white neighborhoods or whites in the black neighborhoods, or you could have busing, which is a disaster. And I thought what they should have is honor schools. Detroit had a school called Cass Tech, which is in the center of town. Anybody could go to that school. And therefore, it was a black and white school, and it had it was the best. Cass Tech was the best high school in the city. If you want to go to college, a lot of people went to Cass Tech. And there was another high school, Wilbur Wright, which was for technical, where you could learn technical skills. And in Detroit, technical skills could pay off because there was lots of work in the tool and die and all that kind of stuff. So I thought a reasonable solution to integration would be to have one school, honor school in the far east, one honor school in the far west, one honor school in the far north, and open to anybody. Now, I would put the honor schools in white neighborhoods. So you'd have Black students coming in, but who's coming in? People are coming in who want to go to school, people who want education. So the racist whites, they'd be angry because Blacks are showing up, but they're getting a good school. And it would not be the usual tension of who are all these strangers and all these buses and what have you. Because if you went to Cass Tech, even if you're white, you had to get on a public bus. There's no bus taking to Cass Tech. You got to get on the DSR, or Detroit Street Railways. But what did the city do instead? The city instead kept changing the boundaries to keep the white white and the black black. Even so, I was involved in the first teacher, a non-white teacher in a white school, and the first white non-white student. Non-white meaning black, not because we had some Asians and Chinese in particular and others, but
we also saw the racial tensions in late 60s, right? The rebellion of 1967, right?
Yes. Well, what happened, of course, is as the 50s rolled on, people began saying, I want my rights, I want my rights. And instead of the city being flexible and trying to really correct itself, it tried to hold the line. And law and order, I call it law and disorder, because the police had horrible, some of them had horrible tactics. There was for a while there, a car of 4 people, and they had machine guns and shotguns and so forth. You only saw them in Black neighborhoods. And they did destruction. Now, one of the things that happened in Detroit, a lot in Detroit, we had a lot of after hours clubs. At 2 o'clock, the bars closed. And therefore, these illegal places opened up, and everybody knew where they were. So these squad cars, whenever they needed to make some headlines or something, just go break one up and get some headlines and get some bookings and so forth. Many of them were in Black neighborhoods. And what happened eventually, all the tensions of the 60s, remember how tense in the 60s were, they happened to raid one of these after hours clubs. And it was being given for a Vietnam veteran who'd just come back from the war. And the riot ensued and became the big riot in Detroit, and lasted for days and days. The National Guard had to come out with tanks and what have you. And even then, after the that what's interesting about that about that riot, or that we call it the Great Rebellion, Blacks did not attack whites. Blacks attacked property. They attacked department stores, factories, symbols of power. Interestingly enough, for instance, several of the attacks were in downtown Detroit near Greektown. And the Greektown merchants were a little worried. So, well, what's going to happen here? And they had their own vigilantes to guard. Nobody came. Blacks didn't attack the Greeks in Greektown because they had no standing grievances.
Because they have built already
a
relationship from the earlier days. This is very...
Again, it wasn't conscious. It wasn't political. It was just like, well, we don't perceive them as being, quote, enemy. Maybe they're indifferent, but they're not enemy.
You think it was a similar situation to other cities in the United States, or this is a particularity of Detroit, or let's say Chicago or New York with the Greek
I think
communities? Yeah,
I think the Greek community in Detroit was different. And part of it also was the UAW, United Automobile Workers, because if you were in the factories, you also worked with Blacks and you got to know some and what have you. I remember speaking with my cubano and I said, well, what do you think of the Black workers? He says, why? He says, you know, the older ones have been around for a long time. They're okay. You can depend on them. I don't know about these young ones. Well, that's all. Whether he's right or wrong, it's sophisticated. It's not like, oh, all of them are scum or all of them are wonderful, which is, you know, starry-eyed view. My father had a bar, as I say, across from Hudson Motors. Now in Detroit, because it was segregated, every bar had its own ethnic group. My father's bar happened to be hillbillies, Appalachians. And I noticed that I had reached a point of consciousness, and I said, Dad, what would happen if a Black guy came in and wanted to have a drink? He said, well, I wouldn't care. He said, you know, well, who do I care? He's going to put out his money, I'm going to give him his drink, but I can't. Because if I do that, the other people in the bar will start a fight and they could boycott me and so forth. So I just go along. And that was typical, I think, of a lot of Greeks, that they went along, but they could have just as easily gone a different way if the society allowed them. Now, as I became more conscious, in the 1960s, I was an honor student. I won things and all that kind of stuff. I finished American history and something was missing. Somehow it didn't make any sense to me, quite some missing element. And I began to frequent left-wing lectures. And we had some very powerful figures then. One group was headed by a Caribbean, another one was headed by an African American, another one is headed by a Jew. And then there was something, the Socialist Workers' Party, which was a mixture, and they had all kinds of speakers. And I began to get a sense of consciousness. But what makes Detroit so powerful is people said, we got to do something. We can't just talk. So here I am, a white intellectual, want to be a writer. What can I do? They don't need me to go march. They don't need me to go organize a Black neighborhood. I'm not in a factory. So I began working with Black intellectuals. And I had a couple of unique experiences. One experience was a Black magazine came out, owned by Blacks, which talked about nightclubs and stuff like that, but also had some political edge to it. And I became the only white writer, and I had a column. And I would go there and write my column, and it would be in the Black community. Well, it was doing something. It was actually a magazine that actually ended up in a nightclub, a magazine they left off in a laundromat for people to pick up. And so you felt like I'm writing my James Baldwin. And yet,
how about the Greek American community and the music that the Black community produced there?
Oh yes,
the Motown records and all this beautiful, all this wonderful music that we still enjoy. Yeah.
Yes, Well, first of all, the Detroit's Greektown had lots of music, and again, because it's Detroit, it was multi-ethnic. So you went to hear Greek music, and one musician was Armenian, you know, and one was something this, and so on, and so Arabic. For a long time, we went to there was a bar that had Greek music. It was run by Lebanese. The big musical night was in the West Side, run where the host was an Armenian. But you know, we hear those music. It was same music, same dancing. And there were actual tavernas in Greektown also. It had interaction with the Black music, but it didn't entwine itself. It was aware of without being connected. Does that make sense? And the same thing is true, I think, for the Black musicians. They knew this ethnic music was thriving. And I knew the guy who founded Motown Records. I could have been a millionaire, but made some mistakes. This magazine I'm talking about, he came to the magazine and he said, I want you to talk about my new record company and so forth. I'm going to give you a stock because I can't pay you. And the people who ran the magazine stupidly said, oh no, we want our $50 or whatever. But Motown guy had a garage. It wasn't a garage. It's like a garage, little house, and had a basement. And that's where he did his records. And he'd go out to every record store in the city and say, put these out, because if you don't put them out, who's going to buy them? And he went to the news radio stations, and he told the disc jockeys, you know, play this is from Detroit, you'll get look. And that's how he built Motown. Well, that's the Detroit way, you know. Okay, Columbia Records ain't coming to me. RCA Victor Records is not coming. Okay, I'll do myself. And I'll make it work. And now pretty soon, well, eventually Motown became bigger than the people that they were talking to. I also was friends with Dudley Randall, who was a very, very fine poet, who was a librarian. And he said, well, these big publishers aren't publishing us, meaning Black writers. So I'm going to publish my own. And he started this broadside press. By the way, my press, called Smyrna Press, one of the first things published by Broadside Press was a co-publication of Smyrna Press and Broadside Press. It didn't last long, but the friendship did. But he just went off and did his books. And he became the biggest poetry publisher of Black poets in the United States. Published all the major poets, introduced some of them, had them in cheap editions. Many, many years later, they made him Poet Laureate of Detroit. But again, that's the Detroit way of let's do it. Let's not talk about doing something. Yeah. If they won't do it, we'll do it.
I would like to stay for a minute to the music part, because when the Greeks came to America, they brought their music too. And many researchers, and I don't know if you agree or not with that, they say that one particular type of Greek music, like the rebetiko, which is the urban marginalized music, yes, has many common characteristics thematically or otherwise, artistically, with the American blues. Although the American blues, they came mostly from rural areas, not urban, as the rebetiko, the Greek rebetiko, but it is a commonality. So it is an underground relationship about African American and Greek culture in terms of musical characteristics.
I agree. And I also would point out the Rebetis, some of them were not such good guys, you know. They were a pretty rough element. And we've tended to sanitize that part of it. But yes, I think there is a connection. And there's a festival in New York every year in which Greek, Rebetiko, and Black blues are in the same program. It's in Harlem. So it's another connection.
We sometimes we organize it in Manhattan, on Madison Street. Big church. I was part of it for a couple of years, and it is interesting that some African American players, they knew some classical Greek songs to play, and fantastic collaboration that shows that ethnic interaction can go to many different ways, and what connects people who went through discrimination. One of the things, which is one of the important things that your book brings so many years ago, before the Black Lives Matter movement, you keep talking about the inequality created by the economic system, by capitalism, how this inequality is above and beyond any other social inequality. And you talk about racism as a systematic, as a systemic problem within the American society. So in those 15 years, from your book to the today's movement and all the experience we live in the past few months, makes your book again relevant, I think, beyond the Greek American community.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, and again, I don't want to sound like a braggart, but my Detroit I Do Mine Dine is read and studied by Black militants to this day. And I think the big character, one thing I see very different between the 60s and what we see the last summer or so, when you had a civil rights movement, it truly was an integrated movement. It was, and a lot of it was spontaneous. It wasn't some organization say, oh, all out for this. People just wanted to go out and demonstrate and protest because of the police killings. And many, many, many of them, in some demonstrations, seemed to be more whites than blacks, because they understood it's a systemic system. It's not just one berserk cop. Now, and I also noticed age. There were a lot of young people, but there were older people as well. Whereas you go back to the 60s, you won't see that. You'll see some of that, but not so overwhelmingly. And in the 60s, people were called out, and they followed a leader. Whereas the last summer, there was no, quote, leader. There were many leaders. There were many, each community had its own way of going. And that I think is very interesting and very positive as far as I'm concerned. And I guess we should talk about GEORGAKAS in 1967 or 63. It's the best thing he ever did. It's the one definite thing I can say about the Greek Orthodox Church that I approve of. He was incredibly brave to be in that march. He's a big man. He's going to wear a black robe, and he's going to be standing next to Martin Luther King. And the Ku Klux Klan said, we're going to shoot. Well, who better to shoot than this crazy Greek priest? And therefore, many people did not want him to march. But because of his own Asia Minor background, because he spent years in the civil rights movement, he knew Martin Luther King. He said, I'm going to do this. And he talked to King and he said, I'm getting death threats and so forth. And King said, I understand. And if you don't want to march, I understand. I know you're not. He did march. And on the cover of Life magazine, but that wasn't his purpose. And that was the moment when Greek Orthodoxy really became a genuine religion, as far as a recognizable religion in the United States. Now, people say, oh, all these Greeks were against him. Nobody left the church. Nobody broke with the church with him about this. And now, of course, everybody's very proud of him. And it's sort of like everybody supported him in 63. They didn't. But I
I think
he showed leadership.
Yeah. Yes.
And by the way, he's a guy whose politics I didn't care for at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Yakov was a political being, and of course, marching next to Martin Luther King also reflects what you described before, that the Greeks had a relationship with the Black community since the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and 40s. So it comes as a continuity to this sentiment. Of course, besides Detroit, comes into my mind now the relationships or employment by Greeks in Florida, and in particular in the sponge industry in Tarpon Springs.
Oh yeah.
When the Greeks employed Blacks in that area. So it is a long tradition of this.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Yes.
When the Greeks arrived in Tarpon Springs, the sponge divers, they were technologically advanced over the Americans because they were used to diving helmets and so forth, the Americans, which is swimming. And there was big conflict between the Native Americans and the Greeks. And when we say big conflict, we mean fistfights, boats being burned, people being shot. And again, talking about systemic racism, the police and everybody was on the side of, quote, the Americans. And so the Greeks needed more people to work on their boats. And they decided Blacks volunteered and they put them on the boats. And what's amazing is how they paid them. They paid them exactly the way they paid everybody else. If you had this job, you got 10%. If you got this job, 12%, and so forth. So they did not discriminate in their employment. And some of the Black sponge divers eventually got their own boats. They were able to be prosperous. And as long as the sponge industry was booming, which is way into the 30s and 40s, Black ships would go out with the Greek fleet. I can't think of any other situation of that kind of intimacy. Again, not that they're bosom buddies, not that they are socializing a lot and so forth, but they were working together, they knew each other. And to this day, Blacks in that part of Florida have good relations with Greeks, very good. If you go down there, Tarpon Springs, the university is run by a Black guy, and he always comes to the Greek events. But he really likes the Greek event. I mean, he doesn't just come because he's got to. I talked to him, for instance, about the Greeks, the Blacks who had fought for the Greek Revolution, and he was interested when we sat and talked about it. So it's that kind of ongoing relationship.
It is a part in your book where you you say that the long and important history of working class Greek America is somehow uh, ignored or not very much in the front within the narrative of the Greek America.
Well, that's one of our successes, and you're part of that too. When I first started reading about Greek America, I had the same feeling I had about reading American history. I said, hey, something's missing here. I read Salutis, very good historian. And he's got chapters on business and this. And I said, where's the chapter on workers? There wasn't any. There weren't any. I said, wait a minute. There were 100,000 Greek workers in the mills in New England. Where are they? There were auto workers. Where are they? There were the miners in the West. Where were they? And so I took one of my intellectual crusades was to revive Greek American history. And myself, some other scholar, Helen Papanikolaou is very important in this, Zis Papanikolaou, yourself, Kapazelos in Greece, and other people came along, and we have returned the stories of struggle. And so now everybody in the Greek American community knows who Louis Tikas is, and they know about the Ludlow Massacre. They didn't know about it in 1965. So we have made some progress in that regard. And I think we're doing even, we're continuing. We're continuing in terms of digging up real history and getting it all into the book. I don't say take out the business guys. I just say put in the radicals. We got conservatives, put them in. We got reactionaries, put them in. That's the story.
But isn't this a problem because of the way we treat Greek American studies within the community? Do we teach Greek American kids about Greek American history?
Not enough. But again, the Americans don't teach Americans much about history either. And you open an American textbook and see what they say about labor and radical movements and so forth. So the Greeks are no worse than anybody else, but they're no better. They're no better. I think that the Finns and the Jewish community has been more candid and honest in covering these things. And lately there's been stirrings in the Italian community of bringing forth these stories. But yeah, I think the whole problem of Greek American history is it's vexing because the community cannot exist without a memory. Memory is history, and history is not just, it includes the family, it includes conversations, it includes the coffee house, but it also includes reading and really knowing what you're talking about instead of just bullshitting as so many people do. Like, I'm not sure if you said to somebody, is Aristotle important? They'll say, yeah. I said, why? And then you get a blank. Yeah. All they know is he's important. Yeah. Oh, Plato, he was important. Yeah. Well, yeah, he helped form Christianity, Christian doctrine.
No, I would like your opinion about that now. I wanted to discuss about the class issue and the racial issue because after the latest events during the pandemic and before the pandemic regarding the movements around the Black Lives Matter, a group of people, I don't know, from Greece, from here, they accused Greek American as being racist. And to me, that was, a little bit strange because we know the history and how close both the African American community and the Greek American community were all these years. So do you think that at this moment of, let's say, social economic mobility of the community, they forgot about that and they are more or they are part of the problem of systemic racism?
Yes, the answer is yes, but with a lot of qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
The more Americanized we become, the more we reflect the mainstream. On the other hand, it's very common when you talk with some Greeks to say, and what are the Americans thinking? I mean, this is a person born in the United States talking about the Americans, meaning that we do realize there's some differences. And I think the Greeks are not virulent racists for the most part. I mean, there's obviously going to be some because that's the way the world is. But they're more passive or maybe inactive. We go along with change, but not initiate it, not be, don't want to go too fast, don't want to go too broad, but not opposed, which is a big difference. And if you said, do you think the police are out of control? They'd say, well, they're police. What do you expect from police? Police always are going to have to be watched. They're always, they're needed, they're essential, but they also cannot be given too much power because that leads us right to the coups.
Because in your book you play with the words because you're also a poet and you create new words and new meanings. You take the word xenophobia and you transform it to xenophilia,
Yeah.
from fear to friendship. So if this is part of the Greek psyche, of Greek culture, to be philoxenos, to be hospitable, why we don't build upon that, or why we don't show it more, if it is this case?
I don't think we show it as a community, but I think we show it as individuals. And this is another thing. People say, what are the Greeks thinking? And they go to some source. And who's the source? Some rich guy who has a newspaper. I'm not talking about the Herald, but people who, are they the community? Or are they just speaking for the community? And of course, if you look at who owns most of these quote sources, they're multimillionaires. So what do you expect them to promote? Now there are exceptions. There are some really good. I think there are some good publications, and we have journals and what have you. But what is Greek American thinking? It's very hard to know. Plus, we are very regionalist and individualistic. So who is able to go around everywhere and hear everything? So what tends to happen is you go somewhere, let's say there's one section of Baltimore, which is an extremely conservative village. People from the same village who in Greece were considered extremely conservative. And the film was made about them and shown Greeks of Baltimore. Well, it's not about Greeks of Baltimore. It's about a small segment of the Greeks of Baltimore. And then if there's some films have been made about Southern California, and it's all about all the terrific progress Greeks have made from the beginning and so on. But see, there didn't be any burps along the way. There was never any struggles. I mean, my research shows me that in 1903, when the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, had one of their first strikes, one of the first guys involved was a Greek. Okay, I'm not saying everybody was like that, but there are a lot of people like that. South San Francisco, which is a suburb of San Francisco, was a very working class area, and they had their own school, and their school teacher of their school was a Marxist. He not only was a Marxist, he was actually a Stalinist. Stalinist in the sense of wanting to shoot people, but he was, authoritarian, whatever the Russians say, etc. He was a school teacher. Everybody knew who he was, but he also knew history, and he knew poetry. He was a poet and so forth. They're not in those textbooks that we see from California. We don't see them in films, and so so there's still a lot of unknown history out there. Unless somebody like if it wasn't for Helen Papanikolaou, would we know about Salt Lake City, which had 10,000 Greeks? In 1913, had 10,000 Greeks. There were 25,000 Greek workers in the West in the 1910s, laying track, mining, chopping trees. And where are they? Well, Helen brought them to us. But if she hadn't, it'd be another missing page. So how many missing pages are there?
Very interesting.
I've tried to do what I could do, but I'm now gotten too old and my eyes are too tired for me to do much basic research. So basically what I do now is just try and get other people and spur them on and keep magazines going that'll publish their work, which is also very important.
Well,
for 10 years.
For sure you have influenced us all, so thank you.
Well, the Journal of Modern Hellenism, for instance, from the Modern Greek Studies Association, for 10 years, did not publish anything about Greek America. So if your primary scholarly journal won't publish you, and you're a scholar, how can you survive? So one of the things I've always tried to do is work with journals that would. So we have the Journal of Hellenic Diaspora, and increasingly now the Journal of Modern Hellenism, which is going to go into a new phase soon. And that's where you can publish. And if you don't get these things out, well, obvious, we got to publish this material, and then somebody else maybe will put them in a book, somebody else will quote them, and that's how you proceed.
Also, you have said for a long time now that one of the problems with ethnic groups and the Greek Americans in particular is that you have the erosion of the language. The language slowly, is not the prime interest to keep it, and also high rates of intermarriages. So those are two forces that they push towards assimilation. And of course, the generational thing. After 4 generations, if there is no renewal, then groups in America tend to be assimilated. This is our destiny, our process, our direction. What do you think about that?
First of all, let's remember that Greek America was saved by the generation that came from 65 to 80. It revitalized the whole community. Very important. Even though there were tensions between the old ones and newcomers, but it revitalized the community. As we go through the 21st century, all ethnic groups are going to have multi marriages. The Greeks have had them for a long time. Anyhow, I think the church records church records show that less than 50% of people married in the Greek Orthodox Church are Greek and Greek. And then think of all the people that are married civil, don't get married in other churches and so forth. So it's a very high rate, probably one of the highest actually. Partly was that because in the beginning there were so many men and not very many women. So if you're going to have a family, you'll have to marry a non-Greek. But we were also entering a new world. The idea of a monolingual America is passé. Anybody who clings to that is back in the horse and buggy. Now, but what does multilingual mean? I think it means many languages. And if you're a Greek, Greek will be your learned language, your second language, not necessarily your everyday language, but useful. So anybody who wants to preserve the Greek language has to make it useful. What good is it to know Greek? That was things would always say, what the hell am I going to attend Greek school for? Nobody cares. Well, if there's no advantages, it's going to die. So the community has to think of ways to make it an advantage. Part of it is hiring. Part of it is more connections with Greece proper, Cyprus, the diaspora. Greeks happen to have a very good relationship with Arabs. So there can be benefits in having another culture. I mean, I think you say, well, we get along better with the Egyptians, let's say, than somebody else. Why? Well, there's enough shared culture that you can connect because you have something other than cherry pie in your head. So I think continuing culture and continuing the language has to be in that context of the 21st century. We're not going to have a segregated community like the one that Cavafy grew up in. That's not going to happen. That's going to happen, not in the United States. So anybody who hearkens to that is just beating a dead horse. So we have to always look forward. New conditions, new changes. And that's why I'm very, the biggest problem I have with conservatives is not that they're cautious, which is fine. And it's not that they're questioning humanity's goodwill, because that can be questioned too. But they have to see changes are happening. So if you don't adjust to those changes, or if you come Johnny come lately, it's not going to work for you. You got to be ahead of the changes. And if you're really super, you'd be ahead of the changes. You initiate the changes. And I think, for instance, if you look at the Greek medical profession, they're leaders in medicine. They're not sitting around saying, let's continue the old ways. They're into all this new stuff. The head of Pfizer is a Greek, for instance, who just came out with the vaccine. He happens to be of Jewish background, he's Greek.
I would like you to conclude our very interesting discussion with one or two things you want to summarize about your book. But before we go there, I would like us to share some things about how you experienced the pandemic all this time. What was your experience? How you survived it so far?
Well, in some ways, I've had an easy time of the pandemic. First of all, writers, researchers are solitary people anyhow most of the time. when we're not out busy sticking our nose into what's going on, we're reading a book or writing and so forth. So being isolated is not so bad. And when you get to be 82, you can't move so fast. So being sequestered is less of a hardship than if you were younger, had a job and a day-to-day job and so forth. On the other hand, you get isolated. You really, hey, what do I want to do? I want to go and have a cup of coffee and talk with my friends. I'm talking about being Greek. I mean, that's the essence. People who know me know, say, oh, let's go for a coffee. Oh, yeah, Dan will be for that. And or have a dinner, not a huge dinner, but with enough people to kind of have an interesting discussion. And I miss that. I miss that. On the other hand, I read a lot of books that I was going to read. You know, everybody's got these books on their shelves, and they say, someday I'm going to read that. Well, someday came. So that's the short of it, pretty much. And of course, I'm very lucky because I have a very wonderful wife, and we spend all our time together, and we don't get on each other's nerves. We actually have gotten closer during the epidemic, not that we weren't close to begin with. So it's got its pluses and its minuses, but I'm glad it'll be over, I think, in about 6 months.
But once more, the pandemic showed the new inequalities as far as concerned who suffered more. And still, the question of class and issue and race, it is, which is the themes you talk about, not only in this book, but also in other books, but in particular in My Detroit, is coming in. Are we going to a new era, solving or starting to have a better race relation situation?
Let me put it this way. The pandemic has revealed all the flaws in American society. Yeah. The wealth gap between the wealthy and the normal person, forget about the poor, is enormous. It's enormous. During the pandemic, I believe that it's, the statistic I just read is that people who are millionaires have added $17 million to their portfolios and so forth. And people who work for a living are in cars getting food bags and happy to get $600 from the government or extended unemployment. That gap has to close somehow. In terms of race, I think the race situation is getting worse and better. And which will prevail, I don't know. But I'm heartened that most of the people who want social change in race are young. They're multi-ethnic. They tend to be better educated. And so if they can assert political power, we could see some changes. And there has been, for all the problems, I disagree with those who say that nothing's happened since the 1940s. Lots have happened. In 1950, I happened to, as I said, I had Black friends. If I was in Greektown, I'd go out with Black friends. If I went anywhere else, I had to be very careful. Might be attacked by Black, or might be attacked by a white. I mean, it was like, I remember a particular time we went out for coffee and some sweets, and there were three of us, three whites and one Black woman. And the Black woman happened to be the wife of a friend of mine. But boy, there was somebody at one of the other tables. He was sure she was my girlfriend. and he made threats. Well, I just went there for a cup of coffee and a donut. You know what I mean? So that's not going to happen today. It's very often. It'll still happen, but not very often. Blacks could not vote. They could not vote. They've just helped elect the president of the United States. And if they vote big in Georgia, they could be the deciding votes. So there have been changes. Now, blacks have paid a tremendous price. I mean, think of all the people who have been shot and marched and beat up and so forth, but there have been progress. So I don't get filled with despair. I am filled with despair that so many people are reacting, that morons tell me that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, as if Hawaii, okay, that's not the United States, okay. That they disparaged the new vice president as being foreign born, even though she's born in America. But still, how can you have she's black and she's Asian too? Terrible. Well, that's the new world. That's the world. That's the world we're heading for. And so the fact that they got elected is kind of good. But 74 million people voted for somebody else. So it's not going to be an easy ride. Frankly, I think the Biden administration either will bring the center back, or we're going to see a split. And you're going to see part of the country go to the left and part of the country go to the right. And who knows what that'll bring forth. The fact that the president of the United States, no, the ex-president of the United States, is talking about martial law and overturning an election, and people are not outraged, don't want to throw him out of the White House 30 days early, is appalling to me. This is not this is the coup d'etat. Now, I don't think he's going to do it. I don't think he's going to be successful. I don't think the military is going along with him. But the fact that he talks about it, wow, that's scary. That's scary. So it's a good time to be alive. I mean, you can say that you can be despairing, or you can say it's a good time to be alive. We can make a difference, but we have to want to make a difference. And we got to put the effort into it. And we got to feel joy in doing it. I don't believe in duty. I believe in joy. And to me, positive change is joy. And however many years got left, I'm going to try and live them to the hilt.
Yes, very well said. Again, today we had a chance to discuss about, a wide area of things based on the 15th year anniversary of my Detroit, growing up Greek and American.
Let me just say for a minute, every picture on the cover,
yes,
all of those people are in my community. The little funny guy in the bathtub, that's me. Then there's a bunch of us in the swimming pool. My mother and her girlfriends, my uncle, my father and his best friend, picture from the old country, picture from people who are real friends of ours, and a kafanion is a symbolic of the world. Yeah. So I try to throw it into the cover as well as write about it.
Very interesting. So change is one of the things you keep talking about the book. Other two or three things you like to mention, you feel strong about the book, and as a conclusion, 15 years later. Yeah.
Well, I also like the ending of my book, in which I recreate the moment of a young kid and what was going on in the 1950s. And I called my Jorio. And I love that. And that community made me. Not I won't give them the flaws. My virtues come from that community. And I honor them. I really do honor them. I respect that generation very much. And I'm sure everybody else will have their own generation they respect and love. But I wanted to put it down how we were, how we struggled, all different things. We didn't even talk about the fact that I talked about gambling in Detroit. I talked about alcoholism. I talked about burying a non-Greek. That was something in the 1950s, how people responded to all that. Funny thing about dating Greek girls, which has become very, has been quoted many times. So, and that's it. That part's a memoir, but it's a memoir which is meant to be more than just me, but to say, this is a community. This is a way of life. We'll never go back there. I don't want to go back there. But that's who we were. I loved it. I loved it then. It was progress for its time from where people had come from. And I guess I want to say this too, particularly to my leftist friends who sometimes are so critical. America was good for the immigrants. I don't know anybody in Detroit in the 1950s who said, oh boy, I wish I'd stayed in Greece. Oh boy, my life would have been much better there than it is here. So America paid off for them. Must call it struggle and success.
It was always in the back of their head, probably, or deep down, this need to return, this wish to return to Greece. And they have high rates of sojourning.
Sojourning, but not returning.
Okay, interesting.
Because they want, because they want to come back home. But we're not that generation. That generation was less critical of the government and more trusting of the American government. Ours is not and should not, because the 50 years since then are different than the 50 years before then. And that's where I know we've been saying change, change, change. We just have to deal with reality. And reality is what it is. And we can change it, we can shape it. How much any one of us or any group can do is unknown. But if you don't go forward, there's no standing still. You're going backwards. You're going backwards. And so there's much to be done. As some famous person said, what is to be done? A lot. But we can do it. At least we can make a stab at it. You're smiling because I know you agree with me. But
I like the message a lot, yes.
but it's important. Joy is important. Rage is important. The
problem is that we live in at a time where the sense of collectivity or act collectively is less inspiring or less happening. Is a more individualistic era than it was before. So how we achieve collectively those goals that are good for the environment, good for society, good for the economy, and for us, you know.
I'm hoping that some Greek American, 20 or 30 years old, will tell us that and how to do it.
Yes.
I look forward to it.
So the poetry of the evolution comes from the future, not the past.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dan Georgakas. It was
Ευχαριστώ πάρα
always a
πολύ.
pleasure and an honor to talk with you. And
I wish we could get together and have a cup of coffee.
of course, or some ouzo, even better.
Oh, even better.
I would love to.
Octopodia.
Yeah. I hope we can do that soon again. And we think of you all the time, and we keep reading your articles and your ideas and your poems. And thank you very much for that. You've been an inspiration.
Oh, okay. If you say so.
Yeah. Well, 15 years later, we talk about your book. So this is a perfect example of this. Thank you very much, Dan.
Okay.
Suho, are you there?
I'm going off.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Okay,
Bye
thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Have a good day. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you. All right, Dan, we managed. Yes, very good.